welcome to Diving Into God, a podcast where we discuss Catholic theology. And now here are your hosts, David and Liz.
Ever feel like some stories have these hidden layers, like there's more to uncover beneath the surface?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, today we're diving deep into one of history's biggest moments, the Passion narrative. Specifically, Luke's version.
Great choice. Luke's gospel is just fascinating.
Even if you think you know this story backwards and forwards,
Trust me.
we're about to unearth some hidden gems.
Yeah.
I'm so ready.
What I find amazing about Luke is how even when things get really tough, really heavy, he never lets go of Jesus's compassion. It's like Luke's not just giving us a timeline of events, he's showing us who Jesus is at his core.
He's giving us that front row seat to history.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he's making sure we catch every single detail, every nuance, especially the timing.
Okay, so what's so significant about the timing? We talking like day of the week stuff? Or...
Even bigger. Luke sets the scene during Passover, deliberately weaving Jesus' story with this ancient festival of, liberation.
Yeah, Passover. So we're talking lambs, unleavened bread, that whole Exodus thing.
You got it.
But how does that connect to Jesus?
Imagine yourself back in Exodus.
Okay, with Moses and Agar.
The Israelites are commanded to sacrifice a lamb, right?
Right.
And they mark their doorpost with its blood.
To show they're God's people.
Exactly. It's this act of obedience, the sign of the lamb that spares them from the final plague.
The death of the firstborn. Heavy stuff.
It really is, and it's a powerful image of protection, of deliverance from slavery.
And that connects to Jesus, taught how?
Just as that lamb's blood saved the Israelites from physical death, Jesus' sacrifice offers humanity salvation from sin, from spiritual death. He becomes the ultimate Passover lamb, fulfilling that ancient ritual.
Okay, I can see how those layers are coming together, but this isn't just Luke making a random connection, right?
Not at all. Remember when Jesus was 12 and he stayed behind in the temple?
Yeah, and his parents were worried sick.
Luke specifically mentions it was during Passover. It's subtle, but it foreshadows everything that will happen during Passover when Jesus is an adult.
Wow. So Luke is setting the stage early on, making sure we don't miss how crucial Passover is in Jesus' life.
Exactly.
But let's move on to the Last Supper itself. It's more than just the last meal, wouldn't you say?
Way more. Luke really takes his time setting the scene.
What do you mean?
He describes the preparations. In detail, Jesus tells Peter and John to find a specific room.
Not just any room.
Right. A room prepared by a man they meet carrying a jar of water. It's all very specific.
Okay, that's a bit mysterious.
It really is. Luke builds this sense of anticipation, like something big is about to happen.
And then there's the bread and wine. Jesus takes those elements way beyond their usual meaning.
This is where the symbolism goes so much deeper than people realize.
Deeper how?
Jesus doesn't just say, this bread, it's like my body, remember me. No, he declares, this is my body given for you. He's transforming the Passover meal into something new and profound.
So it's not just about remembering something that happened in the past anymore?
It's about participating in something much, much bigger.
What do you mean?
This is the institution of the Eucharist, the very heart of Christian worship.
Okay, when you say Eucharist, you're talking about communion.
Exactly. By sharing in the bread and wine, we're united with Christ's sacrifice. We enter into this new covenant he established.
Okay, so I'm following the new covenant part, but can we unpack that a bit more? What does that actually mean? How does it connect back to what we're talking about?
Think back to the prophet Jeremiah. He foretold a time when God would make a new covenant with his people, one written on their hearts.
Not on stone tablets.
Right. Not like the old covenant. Jesus, through his sacrifice, is fulfilling that prophecy. This new covenant isn't about laws and rituals. It's about his body and blood, freely given for us.
So the bread and wine, they're like a physical reminder of this different relationship we have with God now.
It's even deeper than that. Early Christians understood the Eucharist as a real encounter with the risen Christ. Remember, Jesus doesn't say, this represents. He uses the words, this is my body. This is my blood.
Wow. Okay, you mentioned the bread of presence too. Where did that fit into all of this?
Great question. In the Old Testament, the bread of presence was on a table in the temple, right? A symbol of God's presence among his people.
Right.
Well, Jesus, by offering himself as the true bread of life, becomes the ultimate embodiment of that presence.
He nourishes us spiritually.
Exactly, in a way that old bread never could.
And then, to top it all off, Jesus drops this bombshell. He won't eat or drink again until the kingdom of God is fulfilled.
Can you imagine being one of the disciples in that moment?
Talk about a cliffhanger.
Right. It's like he's saying this meal, it's a taste of something far greater, a glimpse of the heavenly banquet to come.
But first,
But first, he has to walk a path of suffering. It's heavy stuff, for sure. We're talking about a betrayal so deep it's hard to even grasp. And Luke doesn't just tell us it happened. He pulls us right into that emotional turmoil with the disciples.
yeah, you can practically feel the confusion in the room.
They're completely blindsided. And then there's Judas agreeing to hand Jesus over for, what was it again?
30 pieces of silver.
30 pieces of silver. It's like, what a contrast.
Talk about human brokenness.
It really highlights how different divine love is, you know? And Luke adds this detail that always gets me. Judas using a kiss, a symbol of friendship,
To betray Jesus.
a betrayal on so many levels, a total violation of trust.
It's heartbreaking. And then on top of that, we have Peter denying Jesus. I always feel for Peter, you know,
Yeah, he was so determined to be loyal.
so sure of himself. But then fear just takes over.
It's a good reminder, though. Even the most devoted followers can mess up. Big time.
That's for sure.
And this is Peter, the rock, the one Jesus is going to build his church on. And even he crumbles under pressure.
He denies knowing Jesus. Not once.
Not twice.
3 times.
Fulfilling that prophecy.
But there's something so powerful about that moment when their eyes meet. Jesus knowing what Peter's done, and Peter realizing the weight of his betrayal.
It's loaded with emotion, but it's not a look of condemnation from Jesus, is it?
No, not at all. It's more like understanding, forgiveness even.
He sees right through Peter's fear, straight to his heart.
And I think that says so much about God, you know, about the second chances. Remember what Jesus said earlier, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church.
He saw past Peter's failure. He saw Peter's potential.
His future as a leader in the church.
Exactly. What an amazing illustration of how God can use our mistakes, even our worst moments, for good.
But let's be real, things are about to get even more intense.
Yeah, the trial, the crucifixion. Luke doesn't sugarcoat any of it.
It's brutal.
It is. But even in the midst of all that suffering, we see God's plan unfolding, ancient prophecies being fulfilled.
Okay, like what prophecies are we talking about here?
Well, take the trials, for example. Jesus is unjustly accused.
Yeah, by the Jewish leaders.
Right. And then he's interrogated by Pilate, mocked by Herod. It's just one thing after another.
It's crazy.
But through it all, Luke subtly connects these events back to Old Testament prophecies.
Which ones?
Prophecies about the suffering servant, specifically Psalm 22.
Okay, I've always loved how the Old and New Testaments are connected like that.
Me too.
But how does Psalm 22 fit in here?
It's amazing, actually. This psalm, written centuries earlier, describes a righteous man. He's mocked, abandoned. His own friends turn against him.
Sounds familiar.
And they even gamble for his clothes. It's exactly what happens to Jesus.
It's like looking at a mirror image centuries apart.
Exactly. Luke's audience, they would have known Psalm 22. They would have recognized those parallels right away.
And understood the significance.
Right. Even something as seemingly small as the Roman soldiers casting lots for Jesus's clothes.
They did that. I always forget that part.
Yep. And it directly connects back to prophecies in Isaiah. It all points to this bigger picture, this divine plan that's been in motion for centuries.
It really makes you appreciate the intentionality of it all. But focusing on the crucifixion itself, even though it's a story I've heard countless times, it's still hard to hear about the agony Jesus went through.
I know what you mean. It's hard to even imagine that level of suffering. And Luke, as a physician...
He would have understood the physical reality of it all.
Exactly. He wasn't squeamish about the details. He knew what crucifixion did to the body. But even as he describes the suffering, he doesn't let the darkness overshadow the light. He still highlights these extraordinary moments of compassion, even in the face of death.
What do you mean, like what stands out to you? Yeah, like what moments?
Well, there's that part with Simon of Cyrene, remember him? The guy who's forced to carry the cross for Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
It kind of foreshadows what Jesus will tell his disciples later. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me.
Intense.
It is. Simon becomes the symbol of discipleship, sharing in Christ's suffering.
What about those women weeping for Jesus?
Yeah.
I've always found that part interesting, especially because Luke seems to really focus on women throughout his gospel.
They're definitely significant. First off, it actually fulfills a prophecy from Jeremiah about women weeping over the Messiah. But it also just shows how unbelievably faithful they were. They're there at the crucifixion, they see him buried, and they're going to be the first ones at the empty tomb.
Wow, talk about devoted. It's amazing how they stick with Jesus, even when everyone else seems to be running away. But before we get to the empty tomb, there's still more to talk about with the crucifixion itself, like the location. It's got to be important that it happens at Golgotha, right? The place of the skull. What's the meaning there?
Oh, it's deeply meaningful, especially in Luke. Remember how we talked about those parallels between Jesus and Isaac? You know, the son Abraham was willing to sacrifice?
Right. And that some scholars think it even happened in the same location.
Exactly. Jewish tradition says that the binding of Isaac went down on Mount Moriah, which later became the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And guess what's also on that traditional site of Mount Moriah?
Don't tell me. Golgotha.
Bingo.
So the place where Jesus is crucified is believed to be the exact spot where Abraham was ready to sacrifice Isaac.
It's a heavy connection, right? Luke doesn't spell it out, but it's there. Jesus, like Isaac, becomes the sacrificial lamb. But this time, it's the ultimate sacrifice. It atones for everyone.
That gives me chills.
Okay.
Okay, so we've got the crucifixion itself, all the symbolism, prophecies coming true. Then what?
Well, Luke, he doesn't skimp on the drama. Right after Jesus dies, this darkness comes over the whole land.
For like 3 hours,
Yeah.
right? I always wondered, was that just for effect? Or was there something more to it?
Oh, it's way more than just special effects. Remember when we were talking about Passover and the Exodus?
Yeah.
This darkness links back to those plagues that God sent on Egypt, specifically that 9th plague. Total darkness for 3 days.
Oh, right. But this time it's only 3 hours, not days.
Exactly. And some scholars point out that those 3 hours from noon to 3, they match up perfectly with when the Passover lambs would have been sacrificed at the temple. It's intentional, don't you think?
Wow. It really makes you think.
The darkness on Egypt when Pharaoh refused to listen to God, and the darkness when Jesus, the true Passover lamb, is sacrificed. It's powerful stuff.
It really is.
Yeah.
So what happens next?
Right then, the veil in the temple, it rips in two, from top to bottom.
Okay, got to be honest. Sometimes I get those temple details mixed up. Can you remind me what the veil was all about?
Sure. Picture this massive curtain separating the Holy of Holies, the most sacred spot in the whole temple, from everything else. Only the high priest could go in there, and even then, only once a year.
On the Day of Atonement.
That's right. It represented that separation between God and humanity because of sin.
So the fact that it tears in two right when Jesus dies, that's huge.
Huge is an understatement. It means that because of Jesus' sacrifice, we have access to God directly. We don't need a high priest or animal sacrifices anymore. Jesus is all we need.
It's like this barrier that seemed impossible to get through has just been obliterated. We can be close to God in a way that wasn't possible before.
Exactly. And it's not just some idea. It should totally change how we think about our relationship with God.
It really should. Okay, so we've got Jesus' death, the darkness, the temple veil. What about his body?
Luke tells us that this guy, Joseph of Arimathea, he asks Pilate if he can bury Jesus. And Joseph's kind of interesting.
How so?
Well, he's part of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, but Luke also calls him a good and righteous man who didn't agree with their decision to condemn Jesus.
I always like that Luke included that detail.
It's like a reminder that even in the toughest situations, even when everyone else is doing the wrong thing, there are still people trying to do what's right.
So Joseph buries Jesus. What's so significant about that?
Well, for one, it fulfills that prophecy that the Messiah would be buried with the wealthy. And remember how Jesus rode into Jerusalem, not just on any animal.
On a colt, right, one that had never been ridden before.
Exactly. It was a subtle way of claiming his kingship. And now, even though he dies a criminal's death, he's given this honorable burial in a brand new tomb, never been used.
Wow, I never caught that connection before. It's like, even in death, those little hints about who Jesus really is,
Yeah.
they shine through.
Totally. Which brings us to the most important moment, the event that changes absolutely everything, the resurrection.
It really is the climax of the whole story. What details does Luke emphasize about that moment?
He really focuses on the women who had been following Jesus.
They were there through it all.
Right. They go to the tomb early Sunday morning with spices to anoint his body, but then they see it. The stone's been rolled away.
And the tomb is empty.
You got it. They're obviously freaking out a little, and then they see these two men, dazzling clothes, the whole 9 yards, and those men drop the bomb. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen.
It's just so powerful how the women are the first ones to witness the resurrection. It really emphasizes what we were saying before about Luke's focus on the role of women throughout his gospel.
I know, right? They were there through his whole ministry, totally faithful, and now they're the first ones to encounter the risen Christ. It says so much about how God works. He often chooses the least likely people to be his messengers.
So the women go tell the disciples, right, that Jesus is alive.
Hmm.
But do they believe it? I can't imagine hearing something like that and just accepting it immediately.
I wouldn't believe it either, and that's exactly how the disciples react. Luke says they flat out didn't believe the women.
Can you blame them? It's not exactly an everyday occurrence.
Not at all. So then, how does Jesus convince them? Does he just pop in like, surprise, I'm back?
Right. Like, missed me.
Nope. It's more subtle than that. We've got those classic doubting Thomas moments, like on the road to Emmaus when he appears to those disciples, but they don't recognize him at first.
It's like those who's making pasta at 2 a.m. pranks on YouTube. They have no idea.
And then there's Thomas, who famously needs to see the wounds for himself.
I love those parts. It's so human, you know, the disciples, they weren't superhuman saints. They were just average people. They had doubts, just like us.
Exactly. I think that's what makes this story so powerful, so relatable. And Jesus doesn't shame them for their doubts. He meets them right where they're at. He shows them his wounds. He eats with them. He's reassuring them, showing them this isn't some ghost story. He's alive.
It's a beautiful picture of how God works in our lives, isn't it? She
Mhm.
gently leads us to faith, even when we're struggling.
Yeah.
But the story doesn't end there. We've got the ascension, too.
That's right. In Luke, we see Jesus taken up into heaven, but before he goes, he gives his disciples their marching orders. Stay in Jerusalem until they're clothed with power from on high, and he promises them that they'll be his witnesses, not just in Jerusalem.
But everywhere, to the ends of the earth.
Exactly. It's the perfect setup for Acts, when the Holy Spirit descends and the disciples are empowered to spread the message.
So the ascension, it's the end of one thing,
Jesus' earthly ministry,
but it's the beginning of something much, much bigger.
the church's mission to the world.
It's powerful stuff. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. Passover, prophecies, moments of incredible grace and love. What's the takeaway? What do we want our listeners to walk away with?
Honestly, I think the heart of the Passion story is just this. God's love is so big, so far beyond anything we can imagine, that he sent his own son to die for us. It's a story about hope, redemption, and the possibility of new life, even when things seem completely hopeless.
It's a story that still matters today. It challenges us to live like Jesus did, with compassion, forgiveness.
Radical love.
Exactly.
It's a call to action for all of us.
So next time you hear this story, really listen. Pay attention to the details. Let yourself be surprised.
You never know what you might discover.
That's right. And that wraps up another deep dive. Until next time, keep digging.